Under the gloomy sky, the auctioneer's voice rang out loudly, breaking the heavy, damp atmosphere. The gavel struck the old wooden block, and immediately, a murmur spread through the crowd of farmers and ranchers gathered. They exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in dismay while others curled their lips in a mocking smile. The horse named Alex, with its reddish-brown coat, was the center of attention. Its muscular, sturdy body was not the subject of the chatter, but its wild, uneasy eyes scan each person as if searching for an escape route. "Don't let appearances fool you," the auctioneer announced with a smirk, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It has ruined countless fences and even broken human bones. A horse that simply cannot be trained." The crowd fell silent, with only the sound of a light cough breaking the stillness, followed by a few awkward chuckles. A man standing nearby whispered to his friend, "This thing is a disaster. No one will want to take it home." 200! A voice suddenly rang out, shattering the silence. Everyone turned to look, their gazes fixated on Johnny Depp, who had just raised his hand. "Johnny's lost it," someone murmured. "That horse is going to eat him alive." Still, Johnny ignored them, his gaze firmly locked on Alex. In that moment of chaos, he saw something unusual in those wild eyes, something beyond the rage, a deep, hidden fear. The truck roared along the dirt road leading to Johnny's farm. Inside the trailer, Alex kept stamping its hooves, making the entire vehicle shake with each jolt. As the ramp lowered, the horse snorted and exhaled heavily, its anxious eyes sweeping over the new surroundings. Jennifer, Johnny's wife, stood outside the stable with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes filled with frustration. "Johnny, have you lost your mind? You just brought a disaster here." Nearby, David, their teenage son, stared at the enormous horse with a mix of fear and curiosity. "It's so huge," he murmured, his voice barely audible, almost only for himself to hear. Johnny didn't answer Jennifer right away. Instead, he slowly approached Alex, step by step. "Easy now, boy," he said, his voice calm, trying to maintain composure. But Alex remained unruly, stamping its hooves hard against the ground before charging straight into the stable gate, causing a wooden beam to crack. Jennifer screamed in panic. "What are you doing, Johnny? Are you trying to destroy the whole farm?" Johnny shouted back, his voice full of resolve. "I'll handle this." Yet none of them could deny the tension that hung over the farm. The other horses in the stable startled, nervously stamping their hooves, adding to the chaos. That night the sky was pitch black, with only the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Johnny sat on the porch, his gaze distant, directed at the stable where Alex was pacing restlessly. Jennifer stepped outside, her arms wrapped tightly in a shawl. She stood next to Johnny for a long moment before speaking. "This farm is struggling. One more mistake and we won't be able to recover." Johnny didn't look at her. He merely whispered, "Alex is more than just a horse. He's something beyond that." Jennifer frowned. "Beyond what?" "A troublemaker. We can't even afford to fix the stable door, Johnny." He turned to her, his gaze firm. "Can't you see the look in his eyes, Jennifer? He's not angry, he's scared. Someone has done something to him, and I'm not going to abandon him." Jennifer sighed but didn't say anything further. In the pale morning light, Johnny stood outside the stable, his eyes stopping at strange marks on the ground. Horseshoe prints mingled with human footprints that stretched toward the forest, forming an unanswered question. He bent down, gently touching the soft earth, the coolness of the early morning seeping through his jacket. "Looks like we didn't just have one guest last night," Johnny muttered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. That evening everything repeated itself. Alex's frantic neighs tore through the quiet night, waking the entire family. Johnny jumped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight. When he reached the stable, he saw a familiar but still haunting sight. The door wide open, mysterious footprints leading into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. Alex, his massive body tense, his coal-black eyes etched with clear unease. Johnny slowly approached, his voice steady but tinged with fatigue. We're in trouble again, aren't we, Alex? The horse seemed to listen. The flashlight light gleamed on his shiny coat, sparkling in the night. Johnny reached out, gently patting Alex's neck. It's just you and me. We'll get through this, he whispered as if making a promise to both of them. Alex took a few steps toward Johnny, his tension easing but only for a moment. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming in the wind broke the fragile peace, as if the darkness itself was deliberately challenging the stillness. Alex reacted violently. He reared up on his hind legs, hooves pounding wildly, the sharp echo breaking through the silent air. Johnny flinched, stepping back to avoid a kick, but he wasn't fast enough. He fell hard onto the cold ground, his breath quickening as he struggled to get up. Jennifer, his wife, stood waiting inside. The smell of coffee and fresh cookies lingered in the air, but it couldn't mask the worry on her face. "Are you hurting yourself again?" she asked, her voice hoarse as she handed Johnny the towel. "I'm fine, really," Johnny replied, wiping the dust off his face. Jennifer crossed her arms, her gaze full of anger. "Fine? You've been losing sleep all week, then chasing after that horse as if it's everything. Where do you think this is going?" Johnny didn't answer right away. He leaned against the kitchen counter, his eyes distant as if struggling with himself. "I think I can fix this, Jen. Alex just needs time, and so do we." Time. And what if time isn't enough? What if all your efforts just leave the whole family in ruin? Jennifer retorted, her voice hard with anxiety. The conversation was interrupted when David, their young son, quietly entered. "Is Alex okay, Dad?" he asked, his eyes full of concern. Johnny nodded, offering a weak smile. "He's fine. He just needs some space." David nodded slightly and went outside. He stopped at the edge of the fence where Alex was grazing. He stood there, keeping his distance, silently watching the horse. "You're not as scary as everyone thinks," David whispered. Alex lifted his head, his dark eyes seeming to pierce through him. The moment stretched on forever. Then Alex snorted, turned away, and went back to nibbling the grass. The next day, Johnny drove into town. His mind was heavy with unanswered questions. At the feed store, he ran into Luke James, an old retired horse trainer. "Luke, have you ever heard of a horse named Alex?" Johnny asked, watching the reaction of the man. Luke paused, his face darkening. "I've heard of him." "Why?" "I own him," Johnny replied briefly. Luke whistled, his expression with a mix of surprise and worry. "You're brave, or maybe just crazy. That horse has been through hell." Johnny felt a chill run down his spine. "Hell? What do you mean?" Luke sighed, his gaze distant. "Alex used to belong to an underground racing circuit. Over there, whips and drugs are just part of the daily routine. He was pushed to his limits, physically and mentally. Then one night, the barn he was in caught fire. Alex got out, but his companion, a mare, wasn't so lucky. When he got home, the image of Alex, panicked and alone, haunted Johnny, like an unhealed wound. He tried to push those thoughts aside, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of that wild horse appeared vividly in his mind. That night, Johnny stood by the fence, the flashlight beam sweeping through the darkness, illuminating every corner of the land. Everything around him seemed quiet, but there was something in the air that made him uneasy. A mark on the gate caught his eye, a symbol tied to the illegal horse racing circuit that Johnny couldn't forget. "Surely it's not a coincidence," Johnny told himself. "Who left this?" Before he could think further, a voice echoed from the darkness, cutting off his thoughts. "Out here by the fence at this late hour, Johnny." The voice was low, calm, yet full of hidden meaning. Johnny turned around, and from the shadows, Felix Jackson appeared. The flashlight illuminated his face, highlighting a half-smile with an unclear intent. Alex immediately tensed, ears upright, eyes locked on Felix as if recognizing a long familiar enemy. "What do you want?" Johnny asked, his voice firm, gripping the flashlight tightly as a defensive weapon. Felix shrugged, his appearance seemingly harmless but carrying an unusual confidence. "Just came to check on the horse," Felix replied, his voice light like a passing breeze. But Johnny and Alex didn't believe him. Every word Felix spoke was loaded with hidden meaning, and something about the way he stood, the way he looked at Alex, made Johnny remain on high alert. When Felix left, the air around them seemed heavier. Johnny couldn't stop thinking about Felix's words. Something's not right, he told himself. But he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. A sense of danger lingered as if Felix were waiting for the right moment. The next morning, Johnny was determined to approach Alex. He carried a bucket of oats and some rope, walking slowly toward the horse's pen. Each step was hesitant, but he couldn't let the wild horse stay that way forever. Johnny slowly extended the bucket in front of Alex. "Come on, boy," he whispered, hoping the horse would gradually get used to his presence. Alex hesitated, standing still for a long moment as if thinking. Finally, it approached, dipping its head into the bucket to start eating. Johnny gently stroked its neck, a tender gesture. "Good boy," he whispered. It was a small step, but for Johnny it was the beginning of new hope, a sign that the horse was starting to open up. For the first time, Alex didn't react sharply when Johnny touched it from the other side of the fence. Unlike before, today it didn't react with intense defense. David stood at a distance, watching every movement of the horse closely. The teenager hadn't forgotten the feeling of standing face to face with the wild, powerful, and cautious horse. Johnny turned to look at him, encouraging, "Try touching it." David looked at Johnny, his gaze hesitant but determined. He climbed the fence, sat on the top rail, and offered a carrot. His hand trembled slightly as he held the carrot, wondering if the horse would accept it from him. "There's only one way to know," Johnny murmured, stepping back to give David space. Alex tilted its ear toward David, its dark eyes narrowing as it studied him. It had been a long time since the horse had encountered someone like this, and it seemed to be evaluating whether this person could be trusted. David stood still, holding his breath as the horse slowly turned its head toward him. Inch by inch, Alex approached, its dark eyes glowing with curiosity. Finally, the horse snapped the carrot from David's hand so quickly that it made his hand hurt. But David's laughter rang out, dispelling the initial fear. "Not so bad," he said in a relieved voice, a joyful smile spreading across his face. Johnny smiled faintly, but his expression turned serious when Alex walked away. That sign showed that the horse was still wary, still figuring things out, just like they were. It's still a long way off, Johnny thought to himself. But at least it was a step forward. That weekend, Felix Jackson appeared unannounced. His truck stopped at the gravel driveway, its wheels crunching as it came to a halt. From inside the horse pen, Johnny saw him and immediately felt a tension rising in his chest. It was like a hammer was hanging over his head. "What are you doing here?" Johnny asked, wiping his hands on a rag as Felix approached. Felix's smile was wide, but it seemed forced as if he were playing a game that Johnny didn't understand. "I heard you've made progress with that horse, so I came to check," Felix replied, showing no sign of concern on his face. Johnny stepped up to the horse pen gate, his expression alert, his eyes never leaving Felix. "It's not for sale, Felix." Felix shrugged, giving a half smile, his gaze shifting back to Alex. "Who said anything about buying? But if you want to sell, I could offer a good price. That kind of horse is more trouble than it's worth." Johnny felt a simmering anger building inside him, his teeth gritting together. "To me, it's worth something." Felix scoffed, not hiding a hint of mockery. "Are you sure? Don't forget its past, keep it close, and you might run into more trouble than you expect." Johnny took a step closer to Felix, his voice dropping. "What do you know about where it used to belong?" Felix's smile faltered for a moment before he shrugged. "Just heard a few things," he said evenly. "Be careful, Johnny." Felix turned to leave, but before disappearing behind the truck, he turned back, his eyes gleaming with hidden meaning. "Well done, Johnny. But don't make me come back." When Felix left, Johnny's mind began to spiral. The darkness enveloped the house, but inside him, everything seemed to light up with chaotic thoughts. An inexplicable sense of unease clung to him. Felix's words, with that enigmatic look and strange attitude, kept him restless. There was something in Felix's tone he couldn't forget, as if it was bringing up a past Felix was trying to bury. Those words kept repeating in his head. "Some things can't be changed, Johnny. You'll understand later." Johnny sat at the kitchen table, the faint light from the desk lamp casting a glow on his hand, where he tightly gripped a small piece of wood. The piece of wood had been taken from the gate, the one Felix had just passed through. The carvings on it were not random. They were familiar symbols that Johnny had seen before in underground racing circles, a world he had tried to distance himself from. A cold sensation spread through his hand as he gazed at the marks, traces of a past he had once witnessed on dark, tempting, and violent roads. He whispered to himself, "Felix is involved in this." At that moment, Jennifer entered through the kitchen door, holding a hot cup of tea. "What are you saying?" she asked, her eyes full of curiosity. She set the cup down on the table and sat across from Johnny, sensing the tension in the air. Johnny held up the piece of wood for her to see. "This was on the gate," he said, his voice steady but tense. "It's a warning or a sign. Felix knows more than he's admitting." Jennifer looked at the piece of wood and then back out the window, where the dense darkness enveloped the distant fields. The light from the desk lamp only highlighted the vague shadows outside, making her feel like someone was watching them. She furrowed her brow, her voice full of concern. "Do you think he's dangerous?" Johnny turned to her, his eyes still fixed on the piece of wood. "I know he's dangerous," he replied, his gaze sharp. "He's not just an old friend, Felix. He has too many secrets. These symbols aren't a coincidence. This is a message, and I fear it has something to do with something I can't let happen again." Jennifer remained silent for a moment, staring at the piece of wood in Johnny's hand. She knew that things weren't as simple as they seemed. What Johnny said made sense, but she also couldn't deny that Felix had once been Johnny's close friend, someone they had both been through so much with. "Don't you think you're overreacting?" she asked gently, though her voice was filled with worry. Johnny sighed, placing the piece of wood down on the table, then rubbed his face with his hand, trying to ease the tension inside him. "Maybe I am overreacting," he admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that everything is being connected. Things have changed since Felix came back. The way he looks at me, the way he talks. I feel like something is being hidden." Jennifer stood up and walked to the window, looking out with a distant gaze. "So, what are you going to do?" she asked, not turning back to look at Johnny. She knew he was torn and didn't want to force him into a hasty decision, but she also couldn't let him continue living in fear. Johnny stayed silent for a long while. He felt the tension in the air, sensing that his relationship with Felix was being tested. "I don't know," he replied, his voice becoming somber. "But I won't let it go on. I need to figure out what Felix is hiding." Just as he finished speaking, a soft knock came at the front door. They both turned to look at each other. Jennifer walked to the door and opened it, revealing a figure standing outside, their face hidden beneath a baseball cap. A strange man with a wrinkled face and sharp eyes stared at them without saying a word. Johnny stood up, a sense of unease flooding him again. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice no longer calm. The man didn't answer immediately and looked at Johnny in a strange way. After a moment, he spoke in a hoarse voice. "Felix sent me," he said. "He wants to speak with Johnny." Johnny felt a cold shiver run down his spine when he heard Felix's name on the stranger's lips. He couldn't understand why Felix would send someone like this to meet him, and why everything was starting to get so complicated. Jennifer stood beside Johnny, her eyes full of suspicion. "Felix sent you?" she repeated, her voice full of doubt. "Why didn't Felix come himself?" The man slightly curled his lips, his gaze sweeping over both of them as if evaluating them. "Felix doesn't want to appear. He has his reasons. But he needs to speak with Johnny. Right now." Johnny felt an uneasy sensation in his stomach. The man's words carried not only urgency but also something mysterious. Johnny looked into his eyes, sensing something hidden, like a warning. "I'm not going anywhere." Johnny replied quickly. "You'll regret this." The man showed no hesitation in his response. Then he turned and left, leaving Johnny and Jennifer behind with a sense of worry and unease. What Johnny feared finally became a reality. Just a few nights later, when the pale moonlight illuminated the sky, Johnny was awakened by strange noises coming from outside the horse stable. The sounds were like wood scraping against each other, followed by metal clinking together. Johnny hurriedly grabbed the flashlight, rushing out of the house with an uneasy feeling overwhelming his mind. He ran quickly toward Alex's stable, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he saw a figure fiddling with the stable door. Felix. He was holding a crowbar, seemingly preparing to break into the stable. "What the hell are you doing?" Johnny shouted, his voice full of anger and confusion. Felix turned around, his face filled with anger and determination. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Johnny. That horse is a burden." Felix growled, his eyes full of frustration. Before Johnny could react, Alex acted. The stable door swung open, and in that instant, the horse appeared, rearing up, its eyes glowing with danger. Its hooves slammed into the ground with a force that echoed, like thunder in the night. Felix stepped back, looking at the horse, then dropped the crowbar onto the ground. He retreated slowly, his steps hurried as if he were avoiding an invisible danger. But Alex, with his massive body and superior strength, advanced step by step, his menacing presence forcing Felix to keep moving without daring to stop. Johnny took a step forward, gripping the flashlight tightly, his gaze determined. "Get out of here, Felix," he said, his voice cold but resolute. Felix glanced once more at Alex, then said nothing more. He simply turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind an eerie silence. After Felix vanished, Johnny sat down on a bundle of hay near the horse stable. He rested his head in his hands, exhausted and deep in thought. Alex stood nearby, breathing heavily but calm. Johnny stared at the horse for a long moment, then whispered, "You saved me." The horse snorted, shaking its head as if it understood his words. But the relief didn't last long. When Johnny went to check the stable, he discovered several mysterious carvings on the wooden beams. These markings weren't just on the gate, but also on the objects around the stable. Once again, unease stirred within him. It seemed that not only Felix, but others were involved in this, and they would not give up easily. In the stillness of the night, as a gentle breeze passed through, Alex lightly touched Johnny's shoulder. Its warm breath blew against his neck like a silent comfort. Johnny looked out into the darkness where shadows cloaked everything. Behind the stable, a chilling sensation ran down his spine. Heavy thoughts filled his mind as if everything was just beginning. He could feel it clearly. This was far from over. The sound of leaves rustling in the light breeze fragmented in the silence. Johnny stood next to the horse stable, the beam from his flashlight cutting through the dense darkness. Inside the stable, Alex paced back and forth, his ears drooping, clearly uneasy. Johnny sensed the tension radiating from the horse, an unmistakable warning. It wasn't just Felix. There were greater forces silently setting traps around them. Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared, breaking the stillness. The sharp noises of machinery mixed with the night wind, signaling the approach of something ominous. A pair of headlights gleamed at the edge of the property, the bright lights gradually piercing through the darkness. The truck slowly rolled in, its heavy tires crunching along the dirt road, emitting a hiss like the footsteps of a giant creature. Johnny's chest tightened, He didn't need to look closely to recognize that the one driving the truck was Felix Jackson. A surge of fear exploded within him, but Johnny forced himself to remain calm. Right behind Felix, two other men stepped out of the truck, their shadows stretching under the faint moonlight. They carried tools, crowbars, and a length of chain, along with some metallic object that faintly glimmered in the light, like a sign of something dark approaching. Johnny stood still for a moment, feeling the chill of the night wrapping around him. He stepped forward, each step firm despite his racing heart. His voice rang out, steady yet full of resolve. "You don't belong here, Felix." Felix turned, sneering slightly, the smirk on his face brimming with self-satisfaction and arrogance. The men standing beside him were like wolves guarding their prey, their eyes cold and threatening. Felix laughed, unable to conceal his contempt. "I warned you, Johnny. That horse isn't worth your concern. You should have listened to me." Johnny didn't respond immediately, merely glaring at Felix with a challenging look. The fear was there, undeniable, but the determination within him had surpassed it all. Behind Johnny, Alex, the horse he'd cared for and protected all this time, suddenly let out a sharp, piercing whinny. The sound echoed through the silent space like a call to battle, a quiet yet powerful declaration of vengeance. Alex lunged out of the stable like a violent storm, its hooves pounding the ground, creating sounds that shook the earth beneath them. Alex's eyes, once gentle and kind, now burned with an intensity never seen before. It towered over the men, its powerful body overwhelming each of their steps. The men recoiled in panic, unable to withstand the force of the horse charging toward them. One of them dropped his crowbar and hurried toward the truck, while the others had no time to react. They were knocked down by Alex and tumbled onto the grass, causing chaos all around. The loud noise from the scuffle triggered the other horses in the stable, making them panic, their whinnies echoing as they ran frantically, adding to the tension in the air. Felix screamed, but his voice was drowned in the chaos, unheard by anyone. Johnny witnessed that moment when Felix faltered, his eyes flashing with hesitation. This was the only opportunity. Johnny knew he couldn't let it slip. He grabbed a shovel nearby and swung it in his hand. His voice rang out, firm without a hint of fear. "This ends here." Felix paused, his gaze darting quickly toward the truck as if contemplating a retreat. But then he made up his mind, retreating step by step. "You're making a mistake," Felix said hoarsely, but his voice carried an undertone of unease. He slowly began to pull back, his movements betraying a hint of weakness. "No, you're the one who's wrong," Johnny replied, his voice firm as an undeniable declaration. He couldn't let Felix continue this threat. He couldn't allow his horse to suffer any more harm. Just then, in the distance, a police car appeared, its red and blue lights flashing through the darkness, illuminating the gloomy space. David, a close friend of Johnny's, stood near the barn, tightly holding a stack of files he had just found. Those papers, the crucial evidence that had been in David's hands for a long time, were now the tools to bring Felix into the light. "This is the evidence," David said to the police chief, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of the discovery. The pages in his hands weren't just information. They were the weapon that would break the criminal world open. Names, dates, and photos, all were clear proof of what Felix had done. The police chief looked at the papers, flipping through each page with a serious gaze. He nodded, as if confirming everything. "That's enough," he said. "This is enough to press charges." Johnny felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, after all these years, they were going to bring Felix to justice. But he couldn't take his eyes off his horse. Alex, despite having fought and protected them, still needed some peace. "You won't get away with this, Felix," the police chief added, his gaze cold and resolute. Felix remained silent, standing still. His men had already withdrawn, and there was no more threat. All that remained was silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of an end. Johnny looked at Felix one last time. "It's over," he whispered. The police chief carefully turned the pages of the documents. nodding solemnly. Each page carried clear evidence, names, dates, and photographs that no one could deny. He raised a hand to stroke his chin, his gaze never leaving the documents he had just reviewed. "This is enough," he said in a deep, authoritative voice, making it clear no one would dare disagree. Everyone in the room fell silent as if awaiting a final decision. Felix, the man in custody, his face full of fear, was led outside. He glanced back at the remaining people in the room, but no one responded to his pleading look. Jennifer stood beside Johnny, her hand resting on his arm. A small gesture, but one full of comfort. She looked at him with grateful eyes, as if all the tension of the past days had been soothed. "You did it," Jennifer whispered, her voice trembling but filled with pride. Johnny could feel her connection, but in his heart, the worry never truly disappeared. He turned to look at Alex, the horse standing still in the stable, its gaze reflecting calm and strength. There was no fear or confusion in the animal's face. "We did it," Johnny said, his voice soft but certain. He felt Alex's resilience, and it gave him strength. In the weeks that followed, the story at the Pinecrest farm spread quickly throughout the town. Those who had once mocked Johnny, who had once ridiculed him for his blind faith in Alex, now came to meet him, showing respect. They no longer looked at him with suspicion, but with admiration, even with apologies. Alex, the horse, had become a symbol of perseverance and determination. "You were right," a neighbor told Johnny, his eyes full of sincerity. "We didn't understand that horse, but now we see it." Alex, the horse that everyone once thought could never be trained, had now become an indispensable part of Johnny's life and the lives of those around him. The bond between David and the horse grew stronger each day. As the days passed, they got closer, learning and understanding each other more. Johnny no longer had to worry about suspicious looks. He focused only on what mattered most: the horse and his farm. One chilly autumn morning, when a thin mist still hung over the ground, Johnny stood by the stable, his eyes fixed on the vast field. He opened the stable gate and let Alex out. The horse stood still for a moment, ears perked as if sensing the freedom waiting for it. A gentle breeze blew, lifting Alex's mane in the air. Suddenly the horse galloped, its powerful legs pushing forward across the field like a storm. Its freedom seemed to send a powerful message, a reminder of the latent strength in every object, in every creature. Johnny leaned against the fence, his eyes following the horse as it ran further away. A smile appeared on his face, gentle and content. Things hadn't been easy, but they had made it through. The Pinecrest farm and the people living there had faced challenges and difficulties not only from nature, but also from people. But now, they stood stronger than ever. "We did it," Johnny whispered, his words echoing in his heart like an affirmation, a comfort, and a source of pride. The fields were now lush and green, a far cry from what they once were when they were just barren, hopeless land. The seeds they had sown had now begun to sprout. The barns had been repaired, and all these changes were proof of perseverance, of not giving up. Jennifer, Johnny's wife, stepped up beside him, leaning on the fence. She looked out at the field, where Alex was still galloping, as if a part of nature, blending with the earth and sky. "You've changed," Jennifer said, her gaze filled with admiration and love. "So have I." Johnny turned to her, offering a soft smile. "Looks like we've both changed," he replied, his eyes filled with happiness. She rested her head on his shoulder, saying nothing more, just feeling the peace that enveloped them. The cool autumn morning still surrounded them, but in each of their hearts, a strong belief in the future had been kindled. Pinecrest Farm had faced storms, both physical and mental challenges. But today the farm stood strong, and the people living there, whether human or horse, were stronger and more resilient than ever. Each day was a new opportunity for them to keep moving forward, to overcome difficulties, and to look toward a brighter future. Johnny looked out at the field, where Alex ran freely, no longer worried about tomorrow. Everything had settled, and this was his home, where he found peace and strength within himself. Finally, as the morning light began to soften and the mist gradually faded, Johnny stood there, his eyes never leaving the horse galloping across the field. He knew that all the effort, all the hardship, had paid off. For him, there was nothing more valuable than this moment when he and Alex, two companions, had overcome challenges to achieve the freedom they truly deserved. Pinecrest Farm, now, was not just a place of work. It had become his true home, a place full of hope and new opportunities. Jennifer stood next to him, both silent, watching the scenery around them. They had overcome all the hardest parts, and now there was only peace and tranquility in their hearts. Though the road ahead was long, they knew that each day was a new step forward. These vast fields would continue to witness new stories and new journeys of Johnny, Jennifer, and all those connected to this place. "We've made it through," Johnny whispered, smiling at Jennifer. "Together, we made it through." Jennifer gently nodded, wrapping her arms around him. They stood there, watching as the world unfolded before them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know what you think about the journey of Johnny, Jennifer, and Alex. What are your thoughts on friendship, perseverance, and freedom in this story? Let us know. Also, if you'd like to continue following inspiring stories like this, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a video. A simple click helps us grow and bring even more wonderful stories. Thank you for being a part of our journey. Wishing you always move forward on your path, just like Johnny and Alex.